Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. I recently did a 20-minute intro to React, so I figured why not do a 20-minute intro to all the main front-end frameworks. So in this one I'm doing a 20-minute intro to Vue. Okay, so in the way I explained in the React video is that all these frameworks, where it's Vue, Angular, React, Svelte, they all take over the front end of your website. So again, in other paradigms, you might have a web server that implements a templating engine. And then basically what's happening is that the server is generating the HTML file every time the user goes to a different page. The difference between using like Angular, React, Svelte, Vue, Solid is that instead of having the server generate each page, you're just having the server deliver this one big sort of JavaScript file. So the HTML page is really just like empty, and then this JavaScript then mounts the entire sort of front end piece on top of it. So the JavaScript is doing the entire job. Vue is just another framework that does this. It has certain aspects of it that make it pretty easy to pick up, and just different ways of kind of doing the same things that React does. Okay, so let's set it up. So let me, well, first close the React server that's still up from the previous video. And let's create a new Vue app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, you could use the Vue CLI. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Vite project generator. Vite is a bundler. It's a really nice bundler that makes it really fast. It can develop apps when you're developing. It's really nice. Just trust me, it's nice. Okay, so you just do npm init vite. Okay, and then what's going to do is going to ask you what kind of project you want to, I'll just say yes. What kind of project you want to do. We're going to call this my first Vue app. And then we can choose like different types of projects. We will choose Vue. Okay, we'll just choose plain Vue. And see, it generates, now my first Vue app has been generated. I will cd into it. So cd into my first Vue app. Okay, and then we're going to do an npm install, because with the Vite generator it doesn't pre-install the libraries, so you just do an npm install. But while that does that, I can start showing you around. Okay, so you're going to pretty much see the same sort of folder structure regardless of which of these frameworks you're using, whether it's React, Vue, Svelte, Angular, Solid. Generally, it's going to be a public folder, and that's generally where all the files you want to, like images, you want to share, like across and use in your app. Then all your JavaScript and CSS and etc. is going to generally be in the source files. Now Vue, and this is also going to be the case for Svelte, is that it uses single file components. So unlike React, where I could put my components in multiple files or a single file, Vue, you kind of have to do it one component, one file. Okay, because generally the way it works is that one Vue file, so it has its own file extension called .vue, is the way it works is that each file has all the JavaScript. Okay, and you see like what you do is you set up a script tag, okay, and then you have a template, which is where you would put the HTML for the component, and then you have a style tag, which is where you would put the CSS for the component. So each component is sort of self-contained in its own file. Okay, so again, all these frameworks kind of start the same way, where there's always like an app component. And so if we take a look at the HTML, see the HTML doesn't really have anything going on. And what happens is that this div here, this div called app, is where they inject the app component. So technically your whole website starts with this app component. Okay, that's the same in React, in Svelte, in Angular, and in Vue. Okay, so let me empty this out. I'm going to do this a little bit more sort of the traditional Vue way. There's a couple different ways you can do this. Okay, so we'll put the script tag here. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase this altogether, so you can kind of see this from scratch. So if you have like Vue snippets installed of an extension, you can type in like so right here, see Vue with default.vue. Okay, and this kind of just generates your sort of basic Vue component. So this is like literally like an empty Vue component. So it's an empty template, an empty script, and generally what happens is that by default, sort of the classic Vue setup is you would export an object, okay, and then everything about the component, all the JavaScript is in this object. Okay, so in this object, first we'd give the component a name. So we're going to call it the app component. Okay, and again, we're mounting this app component. Okay, so this component is being loaded in as app and then being mounted to that div. That's what that line's doing. It's mounting that component to this div. Okay, and then we'll say, well, we'll leave it at that. Okay, so now we'll say that this template is just going to have a div, and we're going to have an h1 hello world. Okay, so this is not like React where it's really like HTML that's being translated into some weird JavaScript. This is actually your HTML. So this is actually the HTML that will be used to render the view. Okay, it's a slightly different approach. Okay, so basically let's run the file. So to run it, let me just take a look at the package.json to see where our scripts are. So in this case, we would run npm run dev to run the dev server. Okay. And yeah, so let's see here. Let's go to localhost 3000, localhost 3000, and there's our hello world. Okay, just like other frameworks, again, all these frameworks, they generally have the same patterns. I can create other components. So in this other folder, I can create other components. I'm not going to use that. Yeah, no, I'm going to create another component from scratch. We'll call this, we'll call it a counter. It'll eventually be used as a counter. Okay, and then again, I would just start this with like the same sort of basic template script tag style. Okay, but there is a second way I can do this. Okay, another way I can do this in Vue is that I still create a component with a name. So this component will be called counter. Okay, and then what we would do is we can actually export a function named setup. Okay, and it's been a while since I've done this. Okay, but essentially the way this works, I could export a bunch of functions, and I can return a bunch of functions and variables, and these variables become available to the template. So I'm not going to do that yet. Actually, I'm going to show you the traditional Vue way. So before we do that, we'll show you how you do what's the equivalent of like React State, but the Vue way. So in Vue, what we would do is we'd add a property to this object called data. And then data would have a function which has to be written using the function keyword. So you can't use arrow functions for this. And what this function can do is return an object. And that becomes data you can use in your template. So in this case, let's just say this data property returns a variable called counter that equals 0. Okay, simple as that. So now I could sit there and say h1, this equals, and then I can inject that counter variable, which uses double curly brackets. Okay, and there we go. I'm going to inject the counter in there. Now I want that counter to show up, so I need to use this component somewhere here. Let me just see, what is it not like? Okay, we're not using hello world anyways. Okay, so what I would have to do is here in the JavaScript, I would import it. So I'm going to say I'm going to import counter from ./components/counter. Okay, so now I'm making it available. And then I'd have to register the component with this component, so that way it knows how to make it available. So I would say components. And then I would pass an object where I can register all the components that exist here. In this case, I'm going to register counter. Okay, now I should be able to use counter like any other component. Okay, and see, now we see 0 here. Okay, so you can see I can create multiple components, say, hey, this component equals this HTML, and I can inject that component in here. And again, this app component is going to act as like your full website. So in this case, I have the h1 hello world, and then here I'm injecting counter, which injects whatever is inside the counter template here. So that way I can make different chunks, like let's say a header bar, like a hero image. Each piece can be its own component. Okay. Cool. And I could pass data to that component. So I could do something like this, like cheese equals Gouda. This is typically referred to as props. Same thing here in Vue. So in the same way it's called props in React, we can call it props here. The only difference is you have that little extra step to use it. So if I want to be able to use that prop, I actually have to create a props property. And then I have to create an array of strings. So with this case, I want to make sure that I know that there's going to be a prop called cheese. That just tells it, hey, there's going to be a prop called cheese. Expect it. It's coming. So now I can sit here and do like h2 and use cheese. And it should show up. Oh, the template requires, oh, I got to wrap these in a div. So like React, there has to be one parent element, so these have to both be wrapped in some other element like that. Save. Okay. And say we see Gouda here. So it recognizes that I am passing cheese. So see, when I use the component in app, it recognizes that I'm passing cheese as a prop, because props are always like passed in when you use the component like an HTML element. Okay. Cool. So again, basically in React and Vue, everything is kind of controlled by this object that you export. So it's all about understanding like what are the things I can define in this object. Every component has its exported object that defines all the parameters of that component. Okay, so we have the data property in which I can return an object with the values, and I can access them in the template. And then I have props where I can define any props that I expect to come in, and then use them inside the template. Okay, cool. So now let's make this counter actually count. Okay, now here you don't have to do anything special. We just need to add 1 to that counter. So what we do is now we would add another property called methods. And here's where we pass this as an object, and here we can define all the functions you want to use in this object. So we'll create a function called add1. And add1 will be a function. Well, again, we use the function keyword. You always have to use the function keyword with Vue. And all this is going to do is take this dot add1. It takes this dot counter and adds 1 to it. That's all it does. Okay, and literally we can just add 1 to it. We don't have to use like a special function to change it. We just add 1 to it. Okay. So now if I want to use this function, all I have to do is now attach it to wherever I want to use it. So I want to say, hey, when you click on the H1, it's going to add 1 to the counter. I would just do, actually the shorthand is you can just do @click, and then I can just say @click and then pass in add1 like that. And then that should be it. Let me just double check. Let's see here if I click here on this and see it works. Every time I click, it's running that function add1, which then updates on the screen. Okay, that I actually find quite a bit easier than React. Okay, if you're familiar with React, I'd have to use this function called like setState, and I got to use that function to update the thing, and I got to be careful about coordinating the state updates. Here I just do the thing, because the way Vue works under the hood is taking advantage of proxy objects, which are objects in which you can kind of define a universal getter setter. So every time you change a property, it's triggering a re-render. Now again, you don't need to understand how that works, but just in case you wanted to look into it, you'd want to learn how proxy objects work in JavaScript. Okay, so those are like the main properties. You have data. Okay, but again, nowadays there's a sort of a new way we can do this, and that's called the Compisition API. So this is like the traditional, which is called the Options API, because you're entering different options in the object. Now there's a new way of doing it. It's not necessarily meant to replace this way. It's just meant to offer an alternative to people who really like React hooks. So if I were to do the same thing, but using the Compisition API, I would get rid of this methods piece. I'll keep the props piece just in case. I'll get rid of the data piece. I don't need these anymore. And what I would do is I would pass a function called setup. And essentially what happens is that at the end of setup, I would want to return any data and any methods that I want. So essentially, instead of having to like these separate sections of the object where I kind of bundle everything together, I just define anything within this function that I need and then return it at the end. So in this case, what we'd have to do is we'd have to import some things from view. So let's just say there from view, and I'm trying to remember what it is. I know it's like ref import ref. Is it ref? To ref. I want to say it's ref. Let me just double check. View composition API. I always forget what the name of the function is. We'll see it soon enough. Yep, we know about the setup function. I just want to know what's the name of the function. It is ref. Okay, so we are using ref. Okay, cool. So my brain has not failed me yet. Okay. So now that I've added this ref function, instead of having to like put all my variables that should trigger updates of the DOM inside that data object, okay, what I would do is in the setup function, I would just say like const counter equals ref 0. So this means that counter is going to just be this variable that's a reference, and when it gets updated, it should update the screen. Okay, very much like React state. And then I would create the function const add 1, which would just say, then what I do is you take equals a function, and what the function does, and I don't think I need to use a function keyword anymore because I'm referring to the ref. So in this case, it's going to be more like hooks. You don't have to worry about using like this, none of that object-oriented stuff. So it's again very similar to the switch from like class components in React to function components. Add 1, then I would just say like it's going to be counter dot value, because the underlying values, it's really an object that has this value property, and that's the thing that it's monitoring because it has like custom getters and setters. So counter dot value plus equals 1. So that's just the kind of weird twist, so that each of these variables, really what you want to change is the value property. You don't have to worry about that in the template. In the template, I still just refer to it as counter. Okay, but when I'm doing stuff here in the setup function, to modify the value, I got to change this value property on this counter object. And then that's it. Then what I would do is I would just at the end of the function return any variables, any refs I created, any methods I've created, all bundled in an object. And this should just now work again. So let's see if it works just like it did before. And it does. Okay. So there's both ways you could do it. You could use the options API where you use the different properties in the object that's being exported, or I can use this new Compisition API where you define everything within the setup function. And again, it just depends, like, do you prefer sort of that more React hooksy feel, or do you prefer sort of breaking everything out into its own section in an object? I kind of like both, you know. There's a lot of other cool stuff you can do, but yeah, you guys kind of get the idea. Again, basically either it's this data property or the setup function. Again, when things change, it'll update the DOM. But again, I don't have to worry about like special setter functions or anything like that. And again, I can do events pretty easily, and I can generate components. And each component has its own file, so I could do all the styling for this component right here. And here I can enter all the JavaScript, and then here I can do all the HTML. And the last piece, do I have time? Okay, I got less than a minute. Let's do it. Like, let's pretend that I also returned an array. Okay, so let's just say const, just do it real quick, const r equals ref, and the ref refers to this array 1, 2, 3, 4. I could also have these cool HTML directives, so I can do something like this, like h3, then do like v4 equals, and I think it's like v4 I would do for like num of r, and then I could do something like num Let me just see if I did that right. I think I messed up the v4 part. So let's just do quickly view v4. The v4 directive. List rendering. Yep. For it's I have the right in. So it's for num in R. And does that become happy now? Okay. Oh, it wants a key. So we'll do the key. Which will be num. Okay, and let's go back over here and let's refresh. Doesn't like it at the moment. Let me just think about why. Theoretically, that should be looping. E4 item in items. Oh, I never exported R. That's why. I had to return R in the function. Okay. And there we go. So you see, all I had to do is this. So like in React, you might be familiar with having to like do maps. And sometimes that can be a little confusing for people. But this, I can just say, hey, v4, make this h3 for each item in R. Okay. And then each item will be called num. And now I can, and there's a lot of really cool, what these are called directives. So if you've used Angular, they have these too. Actually, technically, this is kind of borrowing those ideas from Angular because I think Evan Yu, who created Vue, originally did work on the Angular team back in the old Angular 1.7 and below days. But yeah, so that's a Vue in 20 minutes. So we kind of went a little over 20 minutes, but hopefully that gave you an idea of like how to use Vue and how Vue works. We've just seen how props, how like data works, the options API, and the Compisition API. Have a great day. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.